Welcome to Future Trends, where we examine the latest stories reshaping tomorrow's international dynamics. This week's headlines: Australia gun buyback after Bondi attack, China impose EU dairy tariffs, Poland to restart landmine production to strengthen borders, violence in Bangladesh after death of youth leader, US retaliatory strikes on ISIS targets in Syria, and Japanese woman marries AI partner. Starting with politics, Poland to restart landmine production to strengthen borders. It would be the first time Poland has produced anti-personnel mines since the Cold War to strengthen its eastern borders with Russia and Belarus. After moving to exit the global landmine ban, officials say millions of mines may be deployed, with possible exports to Ukraine and other regional allies. US expands travel ban to 5 more countries. As part of efforts to tighten entry standards for travel and immigration, and following the arrest of an Afghan national accused of shooting 2 National Guard troops, citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, South Sudan, and Syria have been banned from travel to the US, while travelers from 15 additional countries will face partial restrictions. Israel's $35 billion gas deal with Egypt. The Chevron-linked agreement will supply gas to Egypt and was reportedly approved after US pressure. The announcement comes as Washington pushes for a summit between the two nations' leaders amid efforts to expand regional diplomacy. UN elects former Iraqi president to lead UNHCR. Barham Salih will become the next head of the UN Refugee Agency, the first from the Middle East since the late 1970s. US intelligence gathering flights over Nigeria. The flights since late November were reportedly a sign of increased security cooperation between the countries and follow President Trump's threats to militarily intervene in Nigeria over what he says is its failure to stop violence targeting Christian communities. Moving to stories in conflict, violence in Bangladesh after death of youth leader. Protests across Bangladesh followed the shooting death of Sharif Osman Hadi, a key youth leader from the 2024 pro-democracy uprising. In Dhaka, protesters set fire to newspaper offices accused of pro-India bias, with authorities saying the killing was an attempt to destabilize upcoming elections. US retaliatory strikes on ISIS targets in Syria. It followed the killing of 3 American soldiers, the first US death there since the fall of Bashar al-Assad in late 2024. About 1,000 US troops remain in Syria, focused on counter-terrorism operations against ISIS. The Jordanian military said its air force also joined the strikes against Islamic State positions in southern Syria. Record number of executions in Saudi Arabia. At least 347 people have now been put to death this year, up from 345 in 2024, according to human rights groups. Most were convicted of non-lethal drug-related offences, which the UN says is incompatible with international norms and standards. El Salvador sentences almost 250 MS-13 gang members. The members of the Mara Salvatrucha MS-13 street gang had received exemplary sentences for 43 homicides and 42 disappearances, with 10 members receiving prison terms from 463 to 958 years. President Buchal's campaign against gangs that began in 2022 has reduced homicides to historically low levels in the Central American country, but human rights groups accuse the security forces of committing abuses. Australia gun buyback in wake of Bondi attack. It followed its deadliest mass shooting in decades after 15 people were killed and dozens injured when 2 gunmen, reportedly radicalized by Islamic State ideology, opened fire on a Jewish festival at the country's most iconic beach. The gun buyback scheme is the largest since the Port Arthur massacre in 1996, which left 35 people dead and prompted Australia to introduce world-leading gun control measures. Turning to economic news. China impose EU dairy tariffs, broadening trade conflict. Most companies will pay just under 30%, up to a high of 42.7% on dairy products imported from the European Union, the latest in a series of measures against EU exports widely seen as retaliation for the bloc's electric vehicle tariffs. Crypto's slump may be a cultural problem as much as financial. Crypto's downturn reflects not just market dynamics but a cultural credibility problem. Despite regulatory tailwinds, institutional adoption, and political support, Bitcoin has slid into a bear market as investors are wary of scams, meme coins, and criminal activity tied to the cryptocurrency. Qatar bets on cheap power to catch up in Gulf AI race. Qatar is looking to catch up with regional rivals that have already secured a head start in AI. The launch of Kwai, backed by the country's $526 billion sovereign wealth fund and a $20 billion joint venture with Brookfield, marks Qatar's most ambitious move yet into AI. But TikTok signs joint venture to avert US ban over ownership. With a potential ban tied to its Chinese ownership, CEO Shou Chu said ByteDance approved the deal, with Oracle, Silver Lake, and Abu Dhabi-based MGX as major investors. US triples offer to migrants who self-deport to $3,000. The stipend would be given to people in the US illegally who sign up to leave the country by the end of the year. The offer would include a free flight back to their home countries. Now, for news and development. Affordability crisis underpins rising political backlash in major economies. Large majorities in the US, UK, Germany, France, and Canada say the cost of living has worsened, eroding trust in incumbents and weakening political centers. Voters increasingly see the crisis as systemic, fueling pessimism, disengagement, and support for anti-establishment parties, making affordability a decisive issue in upcoming elections. Canadian farmers producing record crops despite droughts, floods. While greater yields in Canada and elsewhere are depressing global prices for grains, climate adaptation practices, which tend to be costly and require cutting-edge technologies, have enabled many farmers to ride out a drought that began in 2020. Sweden. Germany cut aid to focus on Ukraine and defense. Sweden will cut $1.07 billion in development funding to Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Liberia, Tanzania, and Bolivia. Germany's humanitarian budget of $1.23 billion for 2026 will be less than half of last year's, with spending refocused on areas deemed a priority to Europe. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger launch Sahel Regional Force. The 5,000-strong force is the latest in a series of measures by the three African nations to achieve closer integration to counter Islamist threats in the region. Japan prepares to restart world's biggest nuclear plant. Kashiwazaki Kariwa, located about 220 kilometers northwest of Tokyo, was among 54 reactors shut after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami crippled the Fukushima Daiichi plant in the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Since then, Japan has restarted 14 of the 33 that remain operable as it tries to wean itself off imported fossil fuels. Finally, our social news. Spain to open public buildings as climate shelters. A network of government buildings will be made available to the public by next summer to help protect against the increasingly severe heat waves. Food becoming more calorific, less nutritious. More carbon dioxide in the environment is also making food potentially more toxic. Dutch researchers created a method to compare multiple studies on plants' responses to increased CO2 levels. Although crop yields increased, they become less nutrient-dense, plus had increased lead levels. First wheelchair user to reach space. Michaela Benthaus, 33, a German engineer at the European Space Agency, has become the first wheelchair user to travel beyond the recognized boundary of space. Robo-taxis stop in the streets during San Francisco power outage. The Waymo self-driving taxis stopped working and halted in the middle of city streets during the power outage which left 100,000 without power. Japanese woman marries AI partner. More Japanese are choosing to hold wedding ceremonies with fictional characters or AI companions as part of a trend to turn to chatbots to share thoughts and feelings, with some developing romantic feelings for the AI. Experts are concerned that this weakens social connections and will change how people relate to one another. That's your Future Trends update for this week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with more stories reshaping our world.